We're continuing our study in the book of Daniel, and now we're going to give our attention to this 70 weeks prophecy in the 9th chapter of the book of Daniel. Again, one of the most famous Messianic prophecies in the Old Testament. Many view it as perhaps the most important one. Certainly it is one of the most controversial Messianic prophecies. And we will not go into the discussion about some of the liberal critical views of this. Critics would want to try to have the 70 weeks prophecy end up during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, which does not do justice to the chronology in any way. Most Christian interpreters understand the 70 weeks prophecy as a time prophecy bringing us down to the coming of Christ into the world, the birth of Christ and the ministry of Christ. I've provided a chronology for you, a timeline to look at, and maybe we ought to just take about 2 minutes and take a quick look at this timeline so that you understand some of the events that are involved in the book of Daniel. Some of these events relate to Daniel himself, his life. Other events refer to the prophecies found in the book of Daniel. 605 BC is the date we normally can connect to the date of the time Daniel was taken captive. We see that in the first chapter of Daniel. And then 587, 586, the date of the destruction of Jerusalem. Note that in 516 the temple is rebuilt. That gives us a 70-year period for the desolation of the temple. But there's another 70-year period that the book of Jeremiah discusses in chapters 25 and 29. It's the 70 years of the captivity. That probably begins in 605 BC and probably ends with the return of the Jews from captivity. In 539 BC, Babylon was conquered by the Medes and the Persians, and soon after that the Jews return. If we date that return to maybe 537, 536 BC, that gives us almost exactly a 70-year period for the complete total captivity of God's people. Now the Bible is somewhat silent about events after the temple is rebuilt. A few decades later, we read about the events during the time of the book of Esther. Now, Esther is not talking about the Jews who returned from captivity. The book of Esther deals with those who remained back in the Persian Empire. But as far as the activity of the Jews, we have some sources from outside the Bible, but not a lot. The next information really comes from the time of Ezra. In 458 BC, Ezra returns with a group of followers, comes to Jerusalem. It says in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes, and that's Artaxerxes the first. In 444 BC, 445 perhaps, Nehemiah returns in the 20th year of Artaxerxes. Ezra came to teach the law of God. Nehemiah came to rebuild the city walls, to fortify it. When he got there, he saw what disrepair the walls were in. 400 is the date for the end of the Old Testament period in general. The Jews themselves believed that after the prophets Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, that the Holy Spirit departed from Israel. Josephus ends the canonical books, the inspired books, with the time of Artaxerxes, roughly 400 BC, because in his words, the failure of the exact succession of the prophets, and that's in his works, his writing in Against Apion 1:8. That's the section there on the Old Testament canon. And the canon, the books that Josephus accepted and the Jews of Jesus' day accepted, are the same books that we have in our Bible today. The apocryphal books of the Roman Catholic Church were not included. Alexander the Great, his death in 323. His kingdom was divided among 4 generals, but for our purposes, there were the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids in Syria. Initially, the Ptolemies had control over Judea. Eventually, though, around 200 BC, the Seleucids took control. That leads to the persecutions under Antiochus Epiphanes. And that is a key topic in the prophecies of the book of Daniel. There's no question about that Antiochus Epiphanes is described there, certainly in chapter 8 and in chapter 11. Some would argue that he's also there in chapter 7 as the little horn there as well. Liberal critics would date the book of Daniel to 165 BC, where the accounting about Antiochus stops. 4 BC, the birth of Christ. AD 26, the beginning of Jesus' ministry with his baptism. AD 30, the triumphal entry. AD 70, the destruction of Jerusalem. Well, those are just some pegs on the chronological page so that we can understand what these prophecies about the 70 weeks and the future events are all about. Chapter 9, the occasion of the 70 weeks prophecy. The book of Daniel in chapter 9 takes us to the time right after Babylon fell. Now, the prophecy of the four kingdoms back in chapter 2 dated to the second year of Nebuchadnezzar. So that was early on in Daniel's captivity, right? Really after he had arrived, soon after that. Daniel 9 is much later, the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus. Darius, and we're not exactly sure who this was, most Christian students of this argued that probably that's another name for one of two governors or leaders that we know about. And one was named Gubaru and the other named Ugbaru. But the best studies on Darius the Mede have concluded that this was another name for one of these early rulers. Darius seems to have functioned within the Persian Empire. He is not himself the emperor. It says he was made king over the kingdom of the Chaldeans there in verse 1. That's a little unusual terminology. It suggests that he was under the authority of some greater figure. In this case, it would have been Cyrus the Great. And so this is the year 539. And so the occasion of the 70 weeks prophecy is just subsequent to the fall of Babylon. Now the concern here is mentioned in verse 2 of chapter 9. He says, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, observed in the books, that would be that's a term for the Old Testament, the number of years which was revealed as the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet, for the completion of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. Again, Jeremiah chapter 25, verse 11, chapter 29, verse 10, there 70 weeks of captivity. And the fall of Babylon, the conquest of Babylon is clearly the end point for that. And so Jeremiah is looking around and saying, hey, Babylon has been conquered. God, when are you going to act according to your promise? In this prayer, verse 4 and following, I prayed to the Lord my God and confessed. In this prayer, he confesses the sins of the people. He admits that the reason for captivity was valid. He reiterates a number of the things that God's people did to deserve the wrath of God. And as a result of that, they have become a reproach among the nations, he says. But now he calls for God's wrath to be removed, because he's promised that 70 years would be the time limit. And so if we drop down to verse 16, O Lord, in accordance with all thy righteous acts, let now thine anger and thy wrath turn away from thy city, Jerusalem, thy holy mountain. For because of our sins and the iniquities of our fathers, Jerusalem and thy people have become a reproach to all around us. And so now, our God, listen to the prayer of thy servant. O Lord, let thy face shine on thy desolate sanctuary. This term desolate, it's the Hebrew word shamam in various forms. Shomaim, desolation or desolator. But let your face shine on your desolate sanctuary. And then in verse 18, open your eyes, O Lord, see our desolations and the city called by your name. And so the desolation of Jerusalem is the concern here. Daniel wants God to act so that these desolations might be removed. And so the 70 weeks prophecy comes out of this concern concerning the desolations of Jerusalem and calling upon God to restore His people. Just as a preliminary postscript here, it seems to me that when we get to the end of chapter 9, we can conclude that in some ways Daniel has a pretty bad day. Because once he gets the message of the angel Gabriel, once he learns about God's purposes and plans for the future, he finds out at the end of this chapter, at the end of this 70 weeks prophecy, that the final result will be the desolation of Jerusalem. And so the 70 weeks prophecy, which begins with the concern of the desolations of the holy city, ends with the prediction that because the Messiah will be rejected and because of the events that will take place in connection with the coming of Christ, that the holy city and the sanctuary, the city and the temple, will be destroyed in warfare, it says. Desolations are determined. A complete desolation is decreed. Rather ironic that the prophecy that originates with a concern for the desolation of Jerusalem would end with this promise or prophecy of the desolation of Jerusalem. This is one of a few texts in the Old Testament, I think, that clearly speak to the AD 70 destruction of Jerusalem at the hands of the Romans. Well, the answer then, what we're concerned about now in our study, begins there in verse 20. Verse 21, I was still speaking in prayer, and the man Gabriel, angels came in human form. Gabriel means hero of God, if you would, or perhaps simply man of God, whom I'd seen in the vision previously, came to me in my extreme weariness about the time of the evening offering. And he gave me instructions and talked with me and said, O Daniel, I have come now to give you insight with understanding. And so he's challenged to give heed to the message and gain understanding of the vision. Well, Daniel several times in the book of Daniel struggles with what he has seen and at times lacks insight. He is not exactly sure what the meaning of various images and visions really would be. And if you've seen the avalanche of books in the bookstores and all the different controversy about end times, you recognize that we are still struggling with some of the message of the book of Daniel. I have a caution here, and that is that we need to be careful about creating systems of interpretation based upon our interpretation of the book of Daniel or this specific passage. I see an awful lot of proof texting where certain scenarios of the end times are supported by what the book of Daniel teaches. And I would suggest that the teaching in Daniel chapter 9 is anything but clear as far as some of the details about how future events will unfold. There's a great amount of difference in interpretation, even in the translation of some of Daniel chapter 9. All too often, a commentator, a sermon, a preacher will simply perhaps quote the book of Daniel, quote Daniel 9, verse 26, let's say, and quote it out of the New International Version, and then just simply take that translation as the final word, when in fact our translations sometimes differ rather dramatically on how to understand certain phrasing in those last several verses of chapter 9. In my studies of this, and I've not really seen this done elsewhere, but going back to the ancient Greek translations, and there are a couple different Greek translations, one called Theodotion, the other called the Septuagint. They differed radically from what our modern English Bibles understand this passage to be saying. The ancient Syriac church, there's a translation of the Bible known as the Peshitta. It's an ancient Aramaic, Syriac, Christian Aramaic translation. And its understanding of the key verses here really differs dramatically. Apparently Josephus understood some of the wording here in particularly in verse 26, differently from what most of our modern English translations do. And admittedly, the Hebrew is difficult. This is poetry, number one. There's a certain stylistic aspect to it. And just wrestling with some of the language of this text is not easy. I caution anyone to use Daniel 9 as a proof text I mean, if you want to prove that there's 7 years between the rapture and the revelation or the second coming of Christ, and say that Daniel proves this because the final week in Daniel has been postponed, I would suggest that the view that the final week of the 70 weeks, the view that that has been postponed to the distant future, is a product of the system of interpretation. There's nothing in the text itself here that suggests that the last week of the 70 weeks has been postponed for several thousand years. The other weeks follow chronologically successively here, and so one cannot go to the book of Daniel as a proof for the dispensational postponement of the kingdom view, the church parenthesis view, the separate rapture of the church view. Daniel, back in 1830, when John Darby first presented the dispensational theology that is very popular today, he was one of the first, if not the first person to see in the 70 weeks prophecy of Daniel a 70th week that is postponed to the distant future. Josephus understood the language of verse 26, in particular, probably 26 and probably 27, as a reference to the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Josephus believed that Daniel prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem, and in a few places seems to be citing from this very passage. Again, using a different translation, understanding of some of the language than what we typically have in our English Bibles. Well, let me read through this in the New American Standard, and then we'll come back and discuss specifics. 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. And in italics you might see the word place. Literally, the Hebrew says the Holy of Holies or most holy. That expression, Holy of Holies or King of Kings, Lord of Lords, is a Hebrew way of describing the superlative, the greatest King, the greatest Lord, the holiest place. Or it could be the holiest one. In other words, Mashiach, anointed one, could be the most holy one who is here anointed. Let's just say a word about the language thus far after verse 24. 77s. You see, Jeremiah prophesied 70 years before the restoration would occur. Now, Daniel points to that and says, God, when are you going to act? Well, it's clear that God is going to act. But the important restoration is one that will occur not after the 70 years of captivity, but after 77s of years. The Hebrew word shavuah, 7, here is in the plural. 77s. Most understand, and some would say the 70 weeks. But everyone agrees that these are not weeks of days, but rather weeks of years. And so the ballpark number is around 490. 77s are decreed. Now, at the end of these 77s, then, after the 77s have come into place, there are several accomplishments. 6 accomplishments are listed there. Did you pick up that list of verbs and actions there in verse 24? First, to finish the transgression. Second, to make an end of sin. Third, which sounds similar to 2, to make atonement for iniquity. 4, which is a result of atonement. If sin is ended and iniquity is atoned for, then bringing in everlasting righteousness. The finality of this act is expressed in sealing up vision and prophecy. And certainly, the tradition of Old Testament prophets, prophecy that we have in the Old Testament ends. One might argue that it ends because of the atoning work of Christ. One might suggest that because of the rejection of this work by the Jewish nation, that God no longer is going to reveal Himself to them. But anyway, the sealing up of vision and prophecy is noted there. And then anointing the most holy, either place or person. 6 accomplishments. It seems to me that this is a a pretty vivid and detailed way of describing what Christ accomplishes for us. I suggest as a parallel text here, just as by way of explanation, in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 3 and verse 16. There's a remarkable prophecy, one that's not often cited. In Jeremiah 3:16, and there are a lot of interesting 3:16s in the Bible. You might go through those sometime. It says that in those days, when you are multiplied and increased in the land, declares the Lord, they shall no longer say, the ark of the covenant of the Lord. It shall not come to mind, nor shall they remember it, nor shall they miss it, nor shall it be made again. There is a future day for God's people when Israel and Judah will be gathered and will be saved, when the ark of the covenant is not going to have any significance. When the nations will be drawn to Jerusalem or to Mount Zion. When there is this unity of Jew and Gentile, one new creature that Paul speaks about there in Ephesians 2. Jeremiah says the day is coming when the Ark of the Covenant will no longer have significance, will no longer be remembered. Now this is where atonement was made for sin. This is where the slab of gold known as the mercy seat lay. And on that slab of gold, that's where the blood was sprinkled on the Day of Atonement. So this is in the Holy of Holies, in the tabernacle and in the temple of ancient Israel. This is the most important and the holiest spot on the face of the earth. And Jeremiah prophesies the day will come when you will no longer desire the Ark of the Covenant. You will no longer miss it, have no need for it. To me, there's a connection between the accomplishments of the Messiah and what Jeremiah was prophesying back there in chapter 3, verse 16. Well, these 77s are divided up. There is a division of 7 weeks, 62 weeks, and a final week. Without going into detail, and frankly the details escape us because we don't have a clear thing to point to, but it seems that the first 7 weeks have to do with the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the efforts that are involved there when the Jews came back from captivity. And there may be somewhat of a symbolic significance with the number 7 here. The 7 weeks, the 7 sevens. I'm not sure anything magical happened after 49 years. But this first smaller phase is a period when God is concerned about the rebuilding of Jerusalem. The temple is actually rebuilt within 20 years of when they came back. But there is this 7 sevens, or 7 weeks. Now what's going to happen then? Well, verse 25. So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. Book of Ezra talks about the opposition, and as does Nehemiah, the opposition from the Persian officials, from the Jews who lived in the land and resented the Jews coming back from Babylon. There was this critical time when the city walls were rebuilt eventually, the temple was built, the city was fortified. That, I think, is the 7-week period there. And then there is a period of 62 weeks. So after the 7 weeks, there will be this rebuilding of the city. Then, after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off. So there'll be a 7-week period, a 62-week period, and then a final week, a 1-week period. And it will be after the 62 weeks that the Messiah is cut off. Now, there's going to be differences of opinion on exactly where we end this 70-week period or this 62-week period. Now, 7 weeks plus 62 weeks is 69 weeks. That's 483 years. And we have to have some discussion now about when this time period begins and when this time period ends. And then we're going to look at the specific language of what's going on here, there, particularly in verses 26 and 27. Well, there's something called the terminus a quo, which means the end point from which, Latin term, the beginning point, and the terminus ad quem, the end point unto which, or to which. The terminus a quo would be the beginning point of this prophecy. Now, there are two options, two approaches to take. Many conservative scholars have argued that the 70 weeks are symbolic, that we can't necessarily do an exact chronology here. 70 as a number of completion. The number 7 itself is a symbolic number. 70 functions that way in several cases in the Old Testament, as do numbers like 30 and 40, 12. And so the 70 really function symbolically. They are based on the 70 years of captivity. And therefore, we don't need to necessarily find an exact 490-year period here in our understanding. Normally, those who take the terminus a quo in a general or symbolic way understand the decree, the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, as being that which Cyrus the Great issued. Now, Cyrus, after Babylon fell, made a decree that allowed the Jews and other peoples to return to their home and to take materials with them and to rebuild their temples. Nothing specifically stated in the Bible about Cyrus issuing a decree to rebuild the city in its entirety, but at least that could be implied. And so the most famous decree, certainly the one that people can most clearly point back to, is the decree of Cyrus. That, though, would render this number 70 weeks as a symbolic number. There are two approaches to take for the literal chronology. In dispensational theology, it is understood that the numbers in prophecies of years have to do with lunar years or symbolic years, in the sense of a month is 30 days, 12 times 30 is 360, and so every prophetic year is actually 360 years. And they do the mathematics to figure out what the time frame would be if each of the 483 years, the first 69 weeks, where that would take you. And beginning with the decree of Artaxerxes in connection with the rebuilding efforts of Nehemiah, that would be 445 or 444 BC. Beginning with that point, they believe that the 70th week would begin, or the 69 weeks would end, with the triumphal entry. In fact, Sir Robert Anderson, a dispensational writer who worked all the mathematics out on this, believed that he got it to the exact day of the triumphal entry, tried to do that. Now, we need to be cautioned here that there's no evidence that these were necessarily prophetic years in the sense of doing the math and trying to refigure. The Jews themselves, even though they went by a lunar calendar, would every so often have to make up those extra days. Now, we have leap year. We pick up an extra day every 4 years. The Jews, every so many years, would add a second 12th month. It's called Adar, which was the 12th month, Adar and Adar 2. And so every so many years, they would add an extra month, and that would get them caught up. So in Jewish thinking, those years would be the same as our years. And so there's no evidence that we should do some type of complicated calculation and come up with a different number of years for the fulfillment of the prophecy. The dispensationalists, by starting with Nehemiah's return, begin the 70th week with the triumphal entry. Another approach to the literal chronology is to take these as the years that we are accustomed to, the 365-day years, roughly, beginning with a decree in connection with the coming of Ezra, roughly 458 BC. By doing the math there, that brings us to AD 26, AD 27, which would be the beginning of Jesus' public ministry. Now that gets to be a big deal in determining the nature of the last week. If, by my understanding, the Messiah is cut off in the midst of that final week, that would suggest that the final week began with his public ministry. In the dispensational system, the final week has not yet begun. Christ was crucified, he was rejected. Now there's a whole big problem as to when the kingdom was postponed in dispensational theology, and there's a dozen different answers, none of which really seem to work for them. But in their idea, the promised kingdom to Israel was postponed because the Jewish nation rejected Christ. And because of that postponement, then the prophetic time clock stopped ticking, and the 70th week has not yet started. That's where they get the 7 years between the rapture and the second coming. And so in the dispensational theology, it's important not to begin the final week until the end of Jesus' public ministry. So those are the two options. Now, James Smith, in his book, what the Bible Says About the Promised Messiah, suggests, and I think it's worth consideration, that the decree issued is not necessarily a human decree, not necessarily a decree made by a Persian official, but could very well have been a decree uttered by God, that it was time to rebuild the temple and to rebuild the city. We learn in the book of Ezra, chapter 4, that there were efforts to rebuild that were stopped by the Persian government. And so this literal chronology has two possibilities. The one that I favor is that the 458 date is the terminus a quo, and then that takes us to the beginning of Jesus' public ministry as the beginning of the last week. And so under terminus ad quem in the outline, Christ cut off in the middle of the last week. That would be the view that I espouse. Or Christ is cut off before the last week begins. That would be the dispensational approach. Now, and therefore the rapture and the postponement of the kingdom are all tied together there. In the language of verses 26 and 27, and we just have a few moments here, I mentioned that the translation is not easy. And what we read in our NIV and what we read in our New American Standard Bible and other Bibles really is an attempt to render some rather difficult language. But here goes. Let me read 26-27 and let me make the connections that I think are best. So after the 62 weeks, the Messiah, the Anointed One, will be cut off and have nothing. That phrase, have nothing, is very controversial. It's kind of an odd expression, but that's the best that we can do with it, I think. And the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. Now, the prince who is to come is understood as being Rome. The people of the prince who is to come. Now, there's a prince and there's the people of the prince. In dispensational theology, they would argue that the people of the prince were the Romans of the first century. The prince is the future Antichrist of the revived Roman Empire at the end of days. And therefore they divide up the people from the prince himself. It's the people of the prince who destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70, but the prince who is to come will someday set up the abomination of desolation. Now Josephus, when he read the book of Daniel, he understood that the abomination of desolation and the destruction of Jerusalem were somehow tied together. This is what Jesus does with this in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. In Matthew 24 refers to the abomination of desolation as relating to the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Now what I'm saying is controversial for some. Some scholars want to take that term abomination of desolation and they must make it some end-time event, or the Great Tribulation, which is also applied to the fall of Jerusalem there in Matthew 24. Some would argue that the Great Tribulation is a future event after the rapture of the church. Well, again, the interpretation of such passages depends on the system of interpreting these things, not upon the Scriptures themselves. In my book, Leaving the Rapture Behind, I discuss a lot of that sometimes pulling verses out of context in order to fit the system is the normal procedure in some of these end times treatments. Well, the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end will come with a flood. Even to the end there will be war. Desolations are determined. So, at face value, verse 26 says that the Messiah will be cut off, and then the city and the sanctuary will be destroyed. The is that the consequence of the Messiah being cut off? I would suggest it is. That's what the New Testament teaches. That's what Jesus said, is that their house will be left to them desolate because they did not recognize their time of visitation. There at the end of Matthew chapter 23. Jesus makes it clear that the destruction of Jerusalem that would come would be the direct result of God's wrath upon that wicked generation. They did not accept the Messiah who came in their midst. And so, to me, that connection is clear. The rejection of the Messiah, the destruction of the city and the sanctuary. The Messiah is cut off, the city and the sanctuary are destroyed. Now, I would suggest that verse 27 is parallel to that. And he, the dispensationalists, say that that is the Antichrist who enters into a covenant with post-rapture Israel and breaks the covenant in the middle of that 70th week. I would argue that the he refers back to the subject of the verse just previous, which is the Messiah. He is cut off, but he will make a firm covenant, or he will confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. Traditional understanding of that is that Christ, in the midst of that final week, at the end of his public ministry, establishes a new covenant. We talked about Hebrews 8 and Jeremiah 31. The new covenant established, and that new covenant meant that no longer would the Mosaic sacrificial system be in place. The veil of the temple is torn. Christ puts an end to the sacrifice and grain offering. And in doing so, brings about a new covenant. Now, from the side of the Romans, from the side of the Jews, the establishing of that new covenant was because of their killing the Prince of Glory. And so that act, which serves as a glorious act for our redemption, is also viewed as an abomination. The Son of God himself rejected by his own. And so on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate. As a consequence of the abomination of the crucifixion of the Son of God, a desolator will come. The Roman armies will come. Even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. Now, in the NIV, and clearly a dispensationalist was involved in the translating of verse 27, here's the way they read this last part anyway. On a wing of the temple, those words are added in italics, they're not in the text, they're suggested. On a wing of the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation. Now, the words he will set up are not in the original text. Those are added by way of interpretation. So in other words, the translator here has determined that this is the Antichrist who is setting up the abomination of desolation. Note also that in the NIV it is abomination, singular, that causes desolation. The Hebrew is actually plural. The New American Standard says, on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate. I think the New American Standard gives us, I think, a fairer reading of that, and I think makes sense with the traditional view. But be aware of how our translations may vary depending on their eschatological convictions of the translators. And so I would be careful about what the NIV has added in that particular passage. Well, in conclusion then, and again, the great controversy about this passage, traditionally it's been understood as bringing us to the redemptive work of Christ. As a consequence of that, Jerusalem will be destroyed. Now, there are two problems with this, and then I'm going to have to leave you. I'll let you search out the answers on your own, I guess. Problem number one is that AD 70, the destruction of Jerusalem, does not fall within the parameters of the 70th week. I would suggest, but everyone agrees that it's there, and I would just simply suggest that the 70th week takes us to the climactic redemptive work of Christ, and then the consequences of the rejection by the Jews is then added into the mix of the prophecy. The other problem is is when does the 70th week end in the traditional view, in the view that I'm presenting here? Well, there have been different theories. One is that the 70th week begins with the ministry of the Apostle Paul. I don't think the date really works out for that at all. You see, the Messiah is cut off in the midst of the 70th week. And that, again, is where they get that 3.5, built on that. They view that the Antichrist breaks the covenant in the middle of the 70th week, and therefore 3.5 years of league with the Antichrist, 3.5 years of persecution or the Great Tribulation. It seems to me that the cutting off of the Messiah and the putting an end to the Old Testament sacrificial system in the middle of the 70th week brings us to the conclusion of the prophecy, as it brings us, I think, to the conclusion of this talk. I don't see a need for us to try to find an exact end for the 70th week. The 70 weeks prophecy brings us to the final climactic week, and in the midst of that climactic week, Christ brings about everlasting redemption.